I've been introduced a couple of times in my life, not that many, never by a nuclear blast. This whole lecture started about 2 years ago when my brother-in-law, Will, came to me at a family barbecue and said to me, I realize I'm kind of throwing the cart behind the horse, but there's this lecture in my dad's memory once a year, and I was kind of wondering if you'd be willing to give it. I turned around and said, uh-huh. And that started a journey that I had no idea where it was going to take me and how it would alter me. And there are no two ways about it. This has been a change of mind, a change of view, and hopefully the message that I'm going to pass on today is that what's needed is a change of consciousness. Part of the way that we look at the world is in a very sort of what Bob Hunter called operationalistic way. David Bohm called it a fragmentary way. Essentially, it is the telegraphic nature of the world that we live in. Now, any of you who have ever taken a course with me or been anywhere near one of my lectures knows that there's a 0% chance that I'm not going to start with a quote from Nietzsche. About 150 years ago, Nietzsche had a particular concern about the future of what he then called our educational institutions. I'm substituting the word world for educational institutions today because I think that the introduction that he gave in that series of lectures is perfectly apt for what we've got going today. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject I now propose to consider with you is such a serious and important one and is in a sense so disquieting that like you, I would gladly turn to anyone who could proffer some information concerning it. Were they ever so young, were their ideas ever so improbable, provided that they were able, by the exercise of their own faculties, to furnish some satisfactory and sufficient explanation. It is just possible that they may have had the opportunity of hearing sound views expressed in reference to the vexed questions of the future of our world, and that they may wish to repeat them to you. They may even have had distinguished teachers, fully qualified to foretell what is to come, and, my plug for antiquity, like the haruspices of Rome, able to do so after an inspection of the entrails of the present. Now, when I started looking into Bob Hunter the man, I started to realize that Bob Hunter the man was, like anyone here, just a person. He didn't consider himself any different than any other person. And, as Emily mentioned, he didn't believe that there was anything like heroes. Nonetheless, we did come up with the hashtag #EcoHeroHunter, and we want to encourage anyone who is willing to take photographs and tweet and make this live as live it can be. At any rate, as she also mentioned, the idea is that there are no heroes, there are only opportunities. And one of the things that I think is fundamental to the way that he looked at the world was that we don't pay enough attention to the world around us. This operationalistic attitude is one that keeps us from ever seeing what is immediately in front of us. In fact, it keeps us looking behind us. And I'm going to get in part into his view of the nature of power and revolutions as we see them in the world today, and the new version of them that he called in 1961 the new holistic consciousness. It's a journey when you start getting into the writing of Bob Hunter. He wrote, I think, 13 books. I've read just about every word of just about every one at this point, and it's almost impossible to kind of encompass how much he understood about the world that he was in. I was very pleased that in Storming of the Mind, the first one that I read from 1971, one of the first things that he mentions is that what we need more of in the world is The Who, because I'm a big Who fan. At any rate, I'll get into why that was the case in a little bit. Other way. One of the principles that he worked on, or worked on the basis of, was a Buddhist principle. And Buddhism will come up more than once in this, although Bob himself believed that organized religion was probably not the right way to go. One of the principles that they have starts this way, with think big, very big. His concern started initially with the counterculture movement. He was, in a 1986 interview with another one of the Greenpeace founders, Will Jackson, who I had the pleasure of talking to for a couple of hours on Sunday with, pointed out that he was the first counterculture journalist in Canada and has this distinction of being the last counterculture journalist in Canada. In the 1960s, he was working at the Vancouver Sun. And he was hired essentially because he started shouting about what was going on. Now, initially people said, you're going to get fired, stop doing that. But when the Vancouver Sun started getting protest letters against his articles, the editors of the Vancouver Sun said, wow, we're onto something with this guy, let's keep it going. That turned very quickly into a burgeoning or an embryonic form of environmental activism when he got attached to the anti-nuclear movement. He went to the talks that were being given there at the Peace Arch in BC when they blocked and sealed the border, the first time in the history of the relations between Canada and the United States since 1812 that border had been closed. The longest undefended border in the world was closed. Why was it closed? Because something had happened. The United States has insisted that there was nothing wrong with what it was that they were doing and there was no danger involved in nuclear weapons. Of course, anybody with half a brain in their head recognizes that the purpose of the weapon is to destroy everything around it, and so obviously there's something wrong with them. At any rate, he went and he talked, and there was a long list of people that were going to give speeches that day. He gave his speech, he did the interview that you saw briefly there in the clip, but a person came up to him when he was done, and the man's name was Irving Stowe. Irving Stowe was an American dissident who had come up to Canada because he wanted away from the Vietnam War. Now, he was far too old to be in the draft or anything like that, but in protest to what was going on in the United States, he decided to move to Canada. Irving Stowe came up to Bob Hunter and said, "Bob, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. We're starting a committee. It's called the Don't Make a Wave Committee." And they sat down in Irving Stowe's living room and they hashed out what became, ultimately, Greenpeace. It came from the idea that Irving Stowe held close to his heart, which is a Quaker notion. That is, you bear witness to the things that go on in the world around you, because not bearing witness allows them to go unseen, unheard, unnoticed. Now, there are lots of things in the world that go on that way, but there are some important ones that really shouldn't. And Bob Hunter, when he realized that this was an attitude that would change the way he viewed the world, realized that it's not just bear witness, it's bear witness for purpose. And so he agreed. I'm going to get on to this boat, nothing but a bunch of rotten planks between me and the ICC, and sail all the way to Amchitka in the Aleutian Islands near Alaska, on the simple premise that the Americans would not be stupid enough to detonate a nuclear weapon if there was a boat full of hippies next door. It was prophetic. Stop that bomb. Canada is not known, or at least was not then known for any sense of activism. But something in the hearts and minds of many, not all, but many Canadians, was wrong with what was going on with the nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon testing. The idea of detonating nuclear weapons just seemed a bad idea. The boat, and this is the wheel from the boat, it's on the living room wall of my brother-in-law's house, was touched by every one of the founding members of Greenpeace. They went through a lot of trouble to try to get this to go off, because the fact of the matter was they didn't have a boat. They didn't have a plan. They didn't know anybody that could sail a boat. And so they marched up and down the wharfs in BC and found someone, a crazy old cat named John Cormack, who eventually said, "All right, if you give me $10,000, I'll take you wherever you want to go." Think about that for a second. This guy was a fisherman. This guy was a fisherman that was not doing very well because his boat was rotting out from underneath him. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't anybody that had anything to do with the counterculture. But something in the way that Bob and the others presented themselves to him let him trust the idea that whatever they were doing was going to be right. When they got into the boat, one of the immediate things that obviously happens when you take 14 hippies and one cranky old fisherman is that they started to get angry at one another. They started to realize that it is cabin fever writ large when there is nothing around you. And they pulled into port. They pulled into port near a village of Kwakiutl indigenous people. These people had heard of what Bob Hunter and the rest of them were doing and embraced them, and in fact made them honorary brothers in that tribe. And Bob Hunter had known for a long time that the idea of the Warriors of the Rainbow, this is a Cree prophecy, that once we screw the planet up badly enough, a group will emerge, and they will emerge as the Warriors of the Rainbow. And it is in defense of the planet that these warriors will fight. They set off, and it was a long and testing journey, and there was no likelihood that they were going to succeed. They didn't know, for example, exactly where the place was. They also didn't know whether or not the Americans would simply be inclined to sink them or arrest them or anything else. And on the way, what happened became part and parcel of the entire Greenpeace movement. That was, an American Coast Guard ship saw them and approached them and boarded them And they all thought that they were going to be arrested, put in jail, and that would be the end of this happy endeavor. As the captain of the ship was looking around the Cormac, the Phyllis Cormac, looking for violations of international law so that he could legitimately arrest them because they were in international waters, they had to find something, the entire crew of the Coast Guard frigate wrote a letter saying that it's only because of the bonds of this military position that we have that we are not standing next to you. We wish you all the luck in the world. They all got disciplined pretty heavily for doing that. Coast Guard's not known for its friendliness in that respect. As they set out, they realized that there wasn't much chance of anything. And sometimes I think of Gilligan's Island when I see this picture. Because the fact of the matter is, it's just headlong. They're just headstrong. They just know that this can't be allowed to happen without somebody noticing. Now, I don't know if you noticed in the clip, but it initially starts off with the Atomic Energy Commissioner from the United States. He was at Amchitka when they ultimately did set off this atmospheric test. And in a long line since then, and I'm not sure if he was the first one, but in a long line of politicians since then, he had the utter stupidity to bring his children and his wife to the nuclear testing site to show how safe it was. Now, I don't care whether it's Tony Blair shoving British beef down his daughter's throat or if it's Bill Clinton having his daughter eat GMO tomatoes. They don't know the science behind what's going on, and they don't understand the possible implications. They are only concerned with the nature of power and that everybody be okay. Big smiles, everybody's happy, to quote from The Simpsons. As they got out, they started to realize that the impediments that had been put in their way were starting to mount up. The ultimate limit when you're on a boat, if it's not a sailing ship, is the amount of fuel in the tanks. And if you can't get fuel from the ports, you can't keep on going. Eventually, the United States decided that they were in violation of customs laws because they hadn't put in a plan that they were going up to Alaska, and they made them pull into port in order to put in the proper customs papers. They decided not to. They did it over the radio. They did it over the telephones that they could get their hands on, and they managed to get the papers in order. But the fact remained, they weren't going to make it on time. That they were not going to make it on time hit them all pretty heavily, and they had to turn the boat around, and in a pretty dejected attitude, they started to head back. But over the wires came that people in Canada had started to recognize that this was wrong. 10,000 high school kids got out of their schools. They were given permission by the school boards to go and protest this movement. 10,000 high school kids taking it upon themselves to put their own education in jeopardy. They didn't know that they would have permission. It's the foresight of the school board to allow them to do that. I can't imagine that kind of thing happening today, unfortunately. But 40,000 people ultimately across Canada were protesting this event. And as they heard this across the radio, they started to realize that it was a victory. Their failure had become a victory. And this is a quote at the end of that passage. I found myself out at the bow, crying as I had not cried for years with joy, the kind of crying people did during the war when news came through of a great victory. We all felt the kind of awe and love that mass movements inspire in those who take part in them, a feeling of unaloneness. And that's where I got the title for this lecture today. This was, in a sense, the conception of what becomes known as the mind bomb. I thank Emily Charles and her friend for coming up with this graphic because it very well depicts exactly what's going on. One of the things that was an influence on Bob Hunter was Marshall McLuhan. Another thing that was an influence was the things that Marshall McLuhan said about the nature of technological society and the influence that mass media was going to have on our consciousness, on how it is that we are. Again, in that 1986 interview with Will Jackson, Bob Hunter says that he doesn't see anything wrong with television. In fact, he says, I have 2 small children. There's one, and where's the other? And he said, we put them in front of the television, and they watch the television, and I've got no problem with it. And Will Jackson says, well, why not? And he said, because they're plugged in. He saw the television as a way to people's minds, as a way to the consciousness that society doesn't yet share, as a way of bringing that consciousness to the fore and introducing new ideas, ideas that would shake you up. he also realized that television was the way to bear witness on a massive scale. If we all see these nuclear tests, we all don't like the idea of them. If we then see film footage of the landscape after a nuclear test, we're struck by the fact that there are no birds, that there are no otters, that there are no lobsters crawling along the seashore. The fact of the matter is that these things are bad, but they go on because we don't pay attention to them. And Hunter's idea was to get people to pay attention to them. Now, obviously, he had enough savvy. He was a journalist himself, so he recognized the idea that there are ways to get this contact with the world. The first campaign that they did after that was the first anti-whaling campaign. It's a bizarre story because it goes through all of the same stir craziness on the boat, all of the different personality issues and all the rest of it. But eventually, they managed to send off one of the members of Greenpeace, Paul Spong, who was an oceanographer and a specialist in whale biology, well, actually, whale psychology, he says, and they sent him off to Iceland. He managed to make contact with a scholar who was studying the whale populations around the world, not because he was an anti-whaling type, but because that was his subject. He managed to get a contact through this guy to another guy in Norway who happened to know exactly where it was that the whaling fleets were going. Now, I don't know if any of you know this, but whaling fleets were what is considered secret intelligence. They don't tell anyone where they're going, primarily because they know what they're doing is wrong. And so Spong snuck into the office, pulled the files out of the drawer while his girlfriend was chatting up the scholar and memorized the longitude and latitude of everywhere that these ships were going, in particular the Russian fleet. And he went back to the telephone immediately after, called them back in Vancouver, and reiterated all of the longitude and latitudinal courses that these ships were going to be taking in order to find the pods. That started it. They now knew where they could go, or at least roughly where they had to be. They got there, it was called the Mendocino Ridge, and they were struck by the fact that there were no whales. No whales breaching, no whales swimming, no pods anywhere. And they realized that this is urgent. This isn't a little bit urgent. This is the beginning of the end if something isn't done. They sailed around in crazy frenzy, looking for any sign of anything. The first sign that they came across, the one that told them that they were on the right path, was a baby whale. Cut open, floated on the surface with a radio signal attached to it. They realized we found them. Now, I don't know if you know how whaling goes. I'm sure none of you are actual whalers. But what whaling fleets do is they shoot the babies. Even though the babies are undersized, according to the International Whaling Commission, because the mothers will go to protect the babies. They don't want the mothers either, but they'll take them if they can get them. What they want are the males, because they're the largest and have the greatest amount of products. One of the things that Bob Hunter recognized when he was looking at these dead whales in the sea was that there isn't anything that comes from this whale that isn't easily replaceable by something else that doesn't involve the mass slaughter of possibly the most important sentient beings in the sea. The other thing that he noticed was that nature has a problem, and the problem happens to be us. Whales evolved about 50 million years ago. I told my friend Paul that it was 150 million years ago, but I had to check that. It was 50 million years ago. They evolved in the oceans from land animals about 50 million years ago. What Bob Hunter noticed was that whales have managed to adapt themselves to every version of predator that we have nightmares about. The land predators with big, nasty, sharp teeth, the sea predators like great white sharks, other forms of sharks, orcas, etc. But we moved so quickly that this species that has managed to survive for 50 million years could not adapt because we moved too quickly after them. He realized at that moment that we are not one species among many species inhabiting this planet, but in a sense we are a parasite on this planet, primarily because we cannot put in control our greed. This shot was taken when they finally got to the fleet. The Russian boat, the Russian factory ship was called the Vostok. The Vostok had been confronted by Greenpeace, and Greenpeace this was their first tactic, they invented this tactic, was dump the Zodiacs into the water and put the Zodiacs in front of ships. Now, it's not in this shot, but more or less this space here is the ship. See if this works. That is the Zodiac. Okay? It's an enormous thing, the ship that they were confronting. But the ship stopped because one hopes they didn't want to shoot a harpoon at human beings. But the ship eventually started up again when they realized that they could move around, move to the side, move to wherever, as these Zodiacs zipped back and forth and back and forth. Nobody on the Phyllis Cormac thought for a minute that the Russians would shoot a harpoon over their heads, so they stayed in front. But they did. And one of the problems that they had was that the reason that they were doing this was to be able to get this on film. Because once it's on film, it's been witnessed, and it can be transmitted. And in transmitting it, what you end up with is a mind bomb. Now, the guy who was doing the filming, because of the jostling in the Zodiacs, the battery cords had been frayed, and his camera kept going in and out. And if you see the raw footage of the scene, it's unbelievable, because it goes black, it goes yellow, it goes C, it goes black, it goes yellow, it goes C. They get back to San Francisco, they pull the film out, they, what do you call that, now that we don't have film anymore? They developed it. And they moved it, they ran it through the projector, and they said, did he get the shot? And that's the shot. Okay? That harpoon is going over the Zodiac, and it goes straight into a whale. This made it to every news agency in the United States, but as Bob Hunter pointed out at one point, all you got to do is get it to New York, because the telecommunications hub of the planet is New York. And if you can get it there, it will go everywhere, and it did. And you'll see in the film, when you come to see it at Hot Docs, how many of the agencies actually picked this up and what an effect this had on the world. Because, as he said on the way back from Manchitka, all of a sudden, people are doing things not in defense of their homes, not in defense of their livelihoods, not in defense of their stuff, but in defense of the planet. We've moved into a new age at that point, into a new form of consciousness. Now, when you get really airy-fairy and new agey about it, it's called collective consciousness. That's actually not all that new agey. Nietzsche criticized it in the 19th century as something that you could hardly pin down in academic terms. But that collective consciousness is simply the collective awareness that the things that our society does aren't known by us and are bad, and we need to know what they are. The second campaign was the anti-sealing campaign, and it was by and large Paul Watson, the head of the Sea Shepherd, that got this campaign off the ground. Whales, yes. Anti-nuclear, yes. But one of the things that Paul Watson says in the film as well, and said at the time, was that he realized that they had all been heavily into Gandhi. And I am quite happy with the notion that Gandhi had, that 20,000 Brits simply cannot rule 300 million Indians if those Indians won't let them. But Paul Watson realized that when they shot that harpoon at human beings in order to kill a whale that could be replaced by simple things, he realized that there is a viciousness. His own tactic was to move in the opposite direction, not from the Gandhi-esque. In fact, he says, Gandhi wasn't working for us anymore. He moved in the opposite direction. But the first thing that he saw in terms of his own agenda was the sealing in the east coast of, or on the east coast of Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador. I lived in Newfoundland and Labrador for a couple of years, and I have to admit that I had a certain amount of sympathy for the fact that this was a process that had been going on for 3,000 years. Indigenous populations prior to it had killed seals for their livelihood, for the pelts and all the rest of it. And the Newfoundlanders that continued to do it did it as well. But Paul Watson realized that there was something different about the way that it was happening now. It wasn't 50 or 100 Newfoundlanders, and there are paintings of them dying on the ice trying to find the seals. It wasn't 50 or 100 Newfoundlanders trying to eke out an existence in, boy, a barren place. Ships, unlike the Vostok, were being sent in not to take 1 or 2 or 100 seals, but to kill all of them. That's the task. Now, when they went out to Newfoundland, they realized that they were heading into a really bad situation, because now it's not whales that they're defending, and it's not Russians in a whaling ship that they're arguing with. It's a bunch of Canadians on the east coast of Canada that are trying to make a living. They realized that their plan to spray organic indelible green dye on the pelts of the pups wasn't going to be allowed, because Canada had a law at the time called the Protection of Seals Act, which is actually the Protection of the Sealers Act, but anybody who's caught damaging a seal pelt will be arrested. He also realized that the population in St. Anthony and Newfoundland was incredibly hostile to what it was that they were doing, because what they see is their livelihood being taken away from them. Now, Paul and Bob Hunter got into arguments about this, a lot of them, because from Bob's point of view, if we can't do the action, we can't bear witness. And if we can't bear witness, this will keep on happening. Eventually, Paul Watson backed down, and Bob Hunter went to a meeting of the community in the local high school, and he explained to them that we're not here to destroy your livelihood. We're not here to keep you from doing what you traditionally do. We're here to let you know that if you continue to let the Norwegian and the Canadian ships kill all of the seal pups, you won't have a job next year. That hit home. And the Newfoundlanders, although they were angry about it, they realized their consciousness had been raised. They started to recognize, at least in part, that there must be an alternative to the wholesale slaughter of the entire resource. It's something that could be learned well. The mind may not be able to move mountains, but it can stop ships. Bob Hunter and Paul Watson stood in front of a sealing ship with their backs turned to it. And it's an icebreaker, and the way these work is that the icebreaker backs up 30 or 40 feet, and then it guns the engines in order to break the ice in front of it. Now, a ship this size is not something that the captain can see over the bow of. They kept their backs to the ship. They didn't change it. In fact, it was initially just Bob Hunter that was standing there, and if you ever see this photograph in color, he's got a very angry, maniacal look on his face, an obstinate look on his face. And as he stood there with his back to it, Paul Watson came up and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to stop the ship." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm going to stop the ship." And Watson said, "Well, now I'm here, hold my hand." So they stood there side by side with their backs to this ship, and the damn thing stopped. Now they attribute it to their minds, that it was their sheer will, that it was their consciousness of their connectedness with the seals that were all over the area that stopped that ship. And it doesn't matter whether you can quantify the reality of that fact, it remains a fact that the ship stopped. Now the idea, that this all comes from the early thinking that Bob Hunter did about the nature of our relationship with the world around us. The first novel he wrote was one called Erebus, and it has to do with the kind of awakening about the relationship that we have with the animals. He's working in a slaughterhouse at the time, or at least the character is working in a slaughterhouse, and he starts to realize that the funk and the filth and all the rest of it, of what's going on in this slaughterhouse, is just as inhumane as the slaughtering of the animals themselves. But the workers in the slaughterhouse are just working, at least from their point of view. From Erebus, he moved on, and Marshall McLuhan became an influence on him, and he started to realize that it is the technological age, it is mass media that is going to give us the ability to let others know, to let others in on the know as to what goes on in order to keep our society running the way that it does. In The Storming of the Mind, he comes up with this idea of a revolution in consciousness.